I think she's doing okay. I understand that Mark and Lisa's son, Brandon, has tested positive. So this is just something we're going to have to live through. They had to do that with the Spanish flu in 1918, and they got past that. I think we'll get past this. I just don't know when, and I don't know how. It's good to see you this morning. It's time for our monthly What is Written study. And our first question wow. My clicker's not working. My enter key's not working. My computer is doing weird things. Now my clicker is working. I don't understand. All right, our first question is this. Where do we find an authorization for a weekly collection from the church? And so let me take you to a passage that we're very familiar with to answer this question. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians in chapter 16, he said, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come." So let's look closely at this particular instruction from the Apostle Paul. He instructed the saints in Corinth that they were to take up a collection, and it was a collection for the saints. Notice that he says, "As I have given orders," so this is not just a recommendation or a suggestion. This is a commandment from an inspired apostle. And notice that he gave this commandment not just to the church in Corinth, but also to the churches scattered throughout Galatia. So several churches were involved. We learn from Romans chapter 15 and verse 26 that the churches of Macedonia, that would have been Thessalonica and Philippi and Berea, those churches had been given the same instruction. Corinth was down in Achaia, and of course Galatia was in the southern part of modern-day Turkey. So this wasn't just a command to the church in Corinth, it was a command to several churches. Notice that he specifies that this collection was to be made on Sunday, the first day of the week, and it is an instruction for a weekly collection. Now you may be looking at that passage and saying, "I don't see weekly there." Well, I'm going to say more about that momentarily. Notice also that this is a command that was to be carried out personally. Each one of the Corinthians were to be involved in giving something to the Lord, and they were to do that as they had been prospered. It would appear that that means that they were to do that in a proportionate kind of way. Now, what about this every week idea? Well, several of our English translations translate that phrase like this: upon the first day of the week. That's the way the New King James translation renders the passage. That's the translation that I preach from typically. But there are other English translations that render it like this: on the first day of every week. There's a listing of translations that render it in that first way, and here's a listing of some translations that render it every week. The New American Standard Bible translates this passage like this: on the first day of every week, each one of you is to put aside and save, etc., etc. The NIV reads, on the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money, etc., etc. Mike Willis, in his commentary, makes this observation. Don't get scared away by the Greek here. But he says the kata, that's the word that's translated on in the New King James Version, is used distributively. McKnight said, and as kata Poland signifies every city, and kata mina every month, and Acts 14:23, kata ecclesian in every church, so kata me and Sabbaton signifies the first day of every week. Mike goes on to say, therefore Paul's instruction is one which must be followed on the first day of every week. So there's this nuance in the Greek text that some of our English translations bring out and others do not. Several examples of this word being translated in this way. There are passages that speak of every year, every city and village, every city, every day, every house, every Sabbath, every synagogue. Several passages that translate this term either as every day or daily. You can see those passages on the chart. Then every week here in 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2, and every month in Revelation chapter 22 and verse 2. So Paul was commanding the Christians in Galatia and in Corinth to lay by in store every week to take up this collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem. Now, some have argued that Paul wasn't really commanding the saints to do this collectively. Rather, the Corinthians were to set aside money in the cookie jar, you might say, at home. I believe that is an incorrect conclusion from the text. I think he is talking about a laying by in store that was done collectively. Let me explain why I say that. The Greek word that's translated collection, was often used by the ancients to talk about religious collections for a god or a temple. Notice that Paul specifies in this passage that this collection was to occur on the first day of the week. And I would ask, why would Paul specify a day if this wasn't done collectively? If the Christians in Corinth were just to put some money aside in the cookie jar, why did he say do that on the first day of the week? Why not Monday or Friday or whenever? The very fact that Paul specifies a day, I think, implies that this was a collective kind of thing. Then notice also that Paul says that they were to do this so that there would be no collections when I come. Well, if they put money in the cookie jar at home, it would have had to be collected when Paul arrived, right? So it seemed to me when Paul says, I don't want there to be collections when I come, he's not talking about something that they did individually at home, laying aside money in the cookie jar, because when Paul got there, then all that money would have had to have been collected together. So I think he's talking about something that was done when the saints assembled together on the first day of the week. Now, a little bit more information about that word that's translated collection. Brother Willis says the usage of this word has a direct bearing on whether Paul is giving a charge for a formal collection at the public services, or is instructing his brethren to put aside a little money each week in a jar at home. Normally, the word refers to a collection in the formal sense. In light of this fact, Paul was not instructing brethren to lay aside some money at home. Rather, he was instructing the congregation concerning a formal collection on the first day of every week. So I believe that 1 Corinthians 16 is the authority for a weekly collection. There are other passages in the New Testament that I believe imply the idea of what I'm going to call a church treasury. Remember that Jesus and the disciples had a money box, and Judas was kind of dipping his hand in the till. Remember that passage? I'll not take the time to read those references. And then in the book of Acts, in a couple of passages, we read about money being laid at the apostles' feet. Again, the idea of a collection of funds. And then in the passage that we've been looking at, there was money collected to help the needy saints in Jerusalem. But we also know from other passages that churches sent money to support preachers. Paul told the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 8, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to do you service. In Philippians chapter 4, and again I'm not going to take the time to read the passage, Paul reminded the Philippians that when he left Macedonia, no other church supported him at that time other than the church there in Philippi. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 9 and verse 16, Paul talks about widows indeed being financially supported by a local church. He says in verse 16 that family members are to take care of their own relatives, that the church might not be burdened. Well, these widows indeed were over 60 years old. They didn't have family to help them. And so money was used, church funds were used to assist these widows indeed. Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that elders that rule well are to be counted worthy of double honor. And then in the very next verse, he goes on to quote a passage from the Old Testament that says, don't muzzle the ox when it treads out the corn. And he quotes a passage from Luke's gospel that the laborer is worthy of his hire. In light of that statement, I believe this double honor involved financial support for elders that were laboring in the Word. And then I would suggest to you that the New Testament implies that a church will need money to do the work that the Lord has instructed them to do. Now, someone might have the question, well, now, hang on, Kevin. 1 Corinthians 16 is talking about a collection for the needy saints in Jerusalem. It doesn't say anything about church money used for other purposes. So what about that? Well, I believe 1 Corinthians chapter 16 is an exclusive pattern for raising funds. The Testament clearly teaches here and in other passages that church funds were raised by the saints in those local churches giving money to the Lord. We don't read about a church raising funds any other way. Having chili suppers or church socials or various things like that. There are denominational churches that are heavily invested in property. The Catholic Church, the Mormons, they own all kinds of things. And they raise money that way. We just don't read about anything like that in the New Testament. And then, as we've already noted, 1 Corinthians 16 specifies, when you take into account that nuance in the Greek text, that this collection of the saints was to be done every first day of the week. But Paul says, as you have been prospered. I think that would necessarily imply, if you haven't been prospered that week, you're not obligated to give to the Lord. But I don't believe that 1 Corinthians 16 is an exclusive pattern for using funds. It's true that that passage is talking about a collection for the saints, the needy saints in Jerusalem. And so other passages, along with this one, clearly indicate that church funds can be used for benevolence, to assist needy saints, either in the local church or in other churches. But I've already mentioned the fact that Paul was supported financially by the church in Philippi and other churches, so we know from those passages that church funds can be used for evangelism. I would argue that if funds are needed for the purpose of edification, that would be authorized as well, because that's a part of church work. And so when we buy class workbooks to assist us in our classes, when we buy materials that the ladies use for bulletin boards and things like that, when we purchase tracts, that money is being used for the purpose of edification. We know from something that the Hebrew writer says that Christians are to assemble together for worship, because he says don't neglect that. So I would suggest to you that ongoing financial needs imply ongoing financial contributions. I believe that general principles can be applied and are applied to specific situations in the New Testament, but that doesn't change the generic nature of those principles. Now let me unpack that. In Galatians chapter 1, Paul says, if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel than that which you've received, let him be accursed. Paul is saying, don't pervert the gospel. Now, in the book of Galatians, the specific situation involved Jewish Christians trying to bind the law of Moses on Gentile converts, or Jewish Christians going back to the law. But here's my question. Is returning to the law the only way to pervert the gospel? No, it's not. So even though this principle in the book of Galatians really is addressing the specific situation of going back to the law of Moses, that principle applies to any way in which we might pervert the gospel. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, Paul instructed the Thessalonians to withdraw from the disorderly. Now, the specific situation in Thessalonica was that they had lazy busybodies in the church. Does that mean that we're to only withdraw from lazy busybodies? Because that was the specific situation that Paul was addressing? I don't think so. Now, in 1 Corinthians 16, you've got church funds raised by contributions on Sunday. The specific situation was a collection for needy saints. Does that mean that funds contributed on Sunday only are to be used to help needy saints? Well, these other passages indicate that that is not the case. Think with me for a moment about the work that Jesus has authorized a local church to do. We're to assemble. We're to observe the Lord's Supper. We're to sing, pray, preach, teach, give. We're to support preaching. We're to help needy saints. We're to discipline, and you might add other things to that list. Well, there are certain things that are expedients that help us do the work that Jesus has instructed us to do. If you're going to assemble, there's a couple things you have to have. Right? Got to have a place. Can't assemble without a place. Going to have an agreed upon time. If John and I are going to get together at McDonald's and I go at 8 o'clock and John goes at 11, unless I hang around for a long time, we're not going to get together. Got to have a place, got to have an agreed upon time. Well, if the Lord instructs a church to assemble, that implies that the church can provide the place to assemble. It might do that by buying a building, renting a building, borrowing a building, something like that. There are certain things that are expedients to help us observe the Lord's Supper: tables, plates, cups, bread, fruit of the vine. Those kinds of things. A songbook, song leaders. If we're going to sing, and we're going to do that in a meaningful way so that we can edify one another, we've got to know the words that we're singing, right? Now, we can memorize those words, but some of us are not remembering things as well as we used to, right? Well, a songbook is just a tool to help us remember the songs and the notes so that we can sing and edify one another. A microphone is a tool to help the fellow leading prayer so that everybody else can hear and be able to say amen at that prayer's conclusion. Have you ever been in an assembly and someone's leading a prayer and you couldn't hear him? Either because the auditorium was so large or because he spoke so softly, kind of like Randy Ritchie, that a microphone kind of helps solve that problem. The church is instructed to teach. Well, Classrooms and maps and literatures are tools that help us do that. Well, I think I've probably made my point. Church funds can be used to purchase these expedient items to help us do the work of the church. If money is needed to do the work Christ has authorized the church to do, then the church must supply that money. But the church is only authorized to raise money through a weekly collection. I appreciate an observation that Brother Robert Turner made in 1967. Brother Turner was one of the preachers that I was fortunate enough to listen to in gospel meetings when I was growing up. I have such high regard for him. He has long since gone on to his reward. But notice what he says. If I didn't believe God had a full-time work, which he wants his saints to do collectively, I certainly would not consider a continuous collection or treasury necessary. Saints who work and worship together scripturally have divine purposes, either specifically or generically, for all they do. It is to the end that these divine purposes may be carried out collectively that the treasury exists, is used, and must be replenished. Thus, when a saint gives, he does so to meet certain purposes. I can conceive of a situation where a local church might not need money on a weekly basis. Let's suppose they don't have a preacher to support. They don't have needy saints to take care of, nor prospects for that. They have a building that's paid for, or they're meeting in a place that doesn't require funds. Remember, the women in Philippi were meeting down by the riverside. Wouldn't want to meet down by the riverside in Kokomo, Indiana at this time of year, I'll tell you that. Well, I can conceive of a situation where a local church, just because of its situation, would not necessarily need a weekly collection by the saints. But in most circumstances, if a church has ongoing work, like this church has, then it needs funds to support that work. Also, let me just remind you that when Paul instructed the saints in Corinth to lay by in store every first day of the week, it was at least a year later when Paul takes these funds to Jerusalem. Well, that would show precedent for a church collecting money for a long-term need. Like perhaps building a church building or something like that. So, that took longer than I was anticipating, which is no surprise to anybody. But I hope that that has answered the question. And certainly if you have more questions, or if anything that I've said is not clear, I'd be happy to talk to anyone about this privately. Well, we don't have time to go to a second question, so I hope this study has been helpful. Thank you.